Welcome to the Natural Health Matters podcast, where I want to help you look and feel your best at any age. I'm your host, David Sandstrom, naturopathic doctor and biblical health coach, and this is episode number 127. Hey, before we get started today, I'd like you to know that I want to get to know my audience better, and I would enjoy having a one-on-one conversation with you about 10 minutes over Zoom. If you'd be interested in that, go to my website, davidsandstrom.com/coffee talk, and you can pick a date and a time and schedule a 10-minute Zoom call with me one-on-one. I look forward to hearing from you. Hello there, Natural Nation. In this episode, we're talking about sex and marriage, and I have on the show Harvard graduate and marriage researcher Shaunti Feldhahn. Her latest book is called Secrets to Sex and Marriage, and we're talking about her book in this episode. Now, disclaimer, this episode is obviously a mature topic. It's not for the little ones. If you're listening to the show with kids, you might want to hit the pause button and come back and listen to this one later. So you might be saying, Dave, I thought your podcast was about health and wellness. Why are you talking about sex and marriage? Well, if you've been listening to the show for any length of time, you know that it's my contention that we maximize our health potential by aligning our lives more fully with God's natural design for spirit, mind, and body. And the spiritual component of health is all about loving relationships, the love we have for God and the love we have for one another and the love relationship we have with ourselves. And if we're married, that most significant one another relationship is that with our spouse. Now, marriage is really good for our health. I like to call marriage vitamin M. When I was researching for my book, The Christian's Guide to Holistic Health, I came across a study that was published in the American Journal of Epidemiology, and they were researching the effects of loneliness and social isolation on longevity. And they found that lifetime single men, under the worst-case scenario, died up to 17 years younger than married men. And women didn't fare much better. They died up to 15 years younger. That's a pretty significant impact on our health and well-being. And that study included all marriages, not just good ones. So marriage is very, very good for our health. It's God's design for marriage that we experience oneness on a physical level. So that makes sex and marriage an important part of our wholeness and our overall health and well-being. What's God's design for sex? Well, we can go to the Word. In Genesis chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, we find this. A man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So that's God's design for sex and marriage, naked and unashamed, and becoming one flesh. Now, as if that weren't enough, we can look at Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. Rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breasts fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. So God's design for marriage is that we enjoy a vibrant, satisfying sexual relationship. If you've been married for more than a couple of years, you know that that's not quite as easy as we might think. A good sex life doesn't happen automatically. We're all believing some kind of myths when it comes to sex, and many of us are uncomfortable talking about it with our spouses. So if you're interested in a more satisfying, fulfilling, regular sexual relationship with your spouse, stick around. This episode is for you. So let's jump into my conversation right now with Shaunti Feldhahn. Today we have on the show my friend and fellow marriage mentor, Shaunti Feldhahn. Shaunti is a best-selling author, social researcher, speaker, and podcaster. With a graduate degree from Harvard, Shaunti uses her analytical background to help relationships thrive. She and her husband, Jeff, have co-authored groundbreaking relationship books with nearly 3 million copies sold. Shaunti, welcome to Natural Health Matters.
It's great to be with you, David. Thanks.
Well, we've been talking about having you on the show for quite a few months now, and we finally made it happen. And I'm really excited. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. We were at a dinner not too long ago where we're like, we've been trying to do this forever, so we just have to actually do this. Yes,
that's exactly right. Yeah, so here we are. So you've got a new book out. It's called Secrets of Sex and Marriage, 8 Surprises That Make All the Difference. And of course, relational connectedness is good for our health. And having a vibrant sexual relationship is good for your relationship. So overall, I'd like to talk a little bit about, what you did with this book. But first, let me tell you this. I read the book twice. I read it myself first, and then I read it with my wife, Michelle. And I found the information there to be insightful, and a lot of it was just mind-blowing. Some of it's counterintuitive, because you dispel a lot of the myths that people are holding.
Yeah.
And frankly, I had some of those beliefs myself, and you cleared up a lot of things for me. There's really some great stuff in there. I wish I had this information 24 years ago when I got married. But anyway, let's start our conversation off the way you started the book off, with the couple on the soccer field. Can you share that story?
Yes, that is one of my favorite stories of all time,
Yeah.
because I should explain to your audience that one of the things that's kind of funny about all of our projects is that we do just tons of interviews. And normally, if we're talking about any other topic, we also do a lot of random interviews, like, in coffee shops and on airplanes. Couldn't
Yeah.
do that on this topic
Right.
of intimacy
Wouldn't
and
work.
marriage, because I would get arrested. But
Yes.
we actually did say, does anyone want to share their experience? And most of the time people shared with me and my husband, Jeff, with their camera blacked out and fake names.
Yeah.
And so we heard all sorts of funny stories. Anyway, this particular story, this one wife said she and her husband, they were both very busy and they didn't connect maybe as often as she wanted. She was the slightly higher desire person in the marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that they did try to do was to keep things fresh and fun, was to let's just say keep promises that they had made to one another when they were younger. They had been dating since like high school.
Mm-hmm.
And because their faith was important to them, they had decided to wait on sex until marriage. But like they teased each other a little bit, like through high school and college, like, okay, when we're married, we're going to come back and we're going to do it here or something. And so they tried to keep those promises to each other now that they've been married for, 12, 15 years. They have a bunch of kids. And so one of those promises was, he was apparently, I guess, a soccer player. And they had said on the sideline of a soccer game, when we're married, we're going to come back to this park, at some point in the middle of the night. And so they decided one Friday night that they were going to do that. And I'm like blushing even as I'm listening to this story. She was so excited to tell this story, but I'm so blushing. Anyway, and so the grandma had the kids and they drove through this dark park. And of course it's way after hours, it's like 1 a.m. And they had a backpack and they went down on the soccer field and, they got started. And
they got busy.
They got busy. And the next thing they know, there's a booming policeman voice saying, stop what you're doing and come up here, and the car with the searchlight, the spotlight. And of course she is mortified and her husband thinks it's hilarious, but she is mortified. And so, they're trying to stuff their, get their clothes back on and, put their stuff together in the backpack. And they go up and these two policemen are like, name and license number, please. Like, I guess they're used to catching people in the park and they were not amused. Mm-hmm. And this couple, they're handing their IDs to these police officers, and the police is like, okay, Bob Smith, 1234 Jones Road. And then it's like Sarah Smith, 12. Wait a minute. This is the same last name. This is the same address. Wait, you're married? And she's like, of course I'm married. Like, I wouldn't do this if I wasn't married. And the husband is like, yes, officer, 12 years, 3 kids. And the officer's like, I thought you were college students. and he's like, dude, this is awesome. And he fist bumps the husband. And so they're like, we will let you off with a warning. And we're almost off of our shift. And one of the officers is like, and I think I might just go home to my wife right now. And I thought that story was hilarious, both because, it's just, you can picture how mortified the wife especially was.
Yeah.
But also the thing that I found really funny about it is Yeah, it's kind of embarrassing to even think about, and that would not be what many couples would choose to do. Don't get me
Right.
wrong. I'm not saying to, go into a park late at night. No.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But I loved the purposefulness that this couple had
Hmm.
about how do we keep things kind of fresh and
Right.
interesting. And that just happened to be, keeping those old promises to one another happened to be their way of doing that.
Hmm.
So that's the reason that, in addition to the fact that the police officers thought that was like, dude, that's the reason I
Well,
love
I'm
that
sure the
story.
police officer was thinking the same thing I was thinking when I heard that story was, how do I get my wife to suggest something like that? Right?
Well, I have told that story now to many people, and many husbands come up to me and ask that question. I'm like, that is probably not going to be many wives, but you guys come up with your own thing.
Well, in a sense, that's what the book is about, right? It's about
Yeah.
communicating and connecting, and understanding one another better, and building that relational connectedness that leads to more sex, right?
Yeah.
So, what makes this book, Secrets of Sex and Marriage, what makes this different from other intimacy books? What did you do differently that others hadn't done yet? What trails did you blaze that were new?
So, all of the books that I have written over the last 20 plus years, because I'm a social researcher, I approach it from a social research perspective of
Hmm.
what, and basically, we're trying to uncover the answer to one question for every single book, which is what are the little things that are going to make a big difference
Right.
in whatever area that we're studying, with the idea of how do we thrive, right, in our
Hmm.
lives, and how do we thrive in our relationships. And so, I've studied things about helping women understand men. Like, what do you not know about your husband or your boyfriend?
Hmm.
Or women, right? The reverse. There's workplace stuff and parenting stuff. And so I took that same approach to this incredibly important topic of intimacy in marriage, and going, okay, this is not this is not going to be a sex manual.
Right.
This is a different approach. This is
Hmm.
what are the little things that are going to matter.
Hmm.
And so we ended up enlisting, for this particular project, because it's such a vulnerable, sacred topic where we could do damage if we got it slightly off. We enlisted one of our main advisors, who's a sex therapist named Dr. Michael Seitzma, and he's one of the most renowned sex therapists, especially in the Christian community in
Hmm.
the country. He's trained most of the sex therapists out there, in one way or another, or at least many of them. And he and myself and my husband Jeff, we basically spent about 3 years doing a bunch of research to try to, okay, what are the myths that people are believing that are getting in the way, and what's the truth? What are the things that are running under the surface that we don't know are necessarily going on, that if we know them, we can go, oh, like we can change things slightly and it has a really big impact. We basically spent 3 years identifying what are those things. We identified 8 of them, that make a big difference to most, not all, but
Hmm.
to most married couples.
Yeah.
Um, and so that is the premise. We did a bunch of surveys. All of our surveys and all of our projects that we've done are pretty rigorous, nationally representative surveys,
Hmm.
because that's something that's actually really important to us. So that it's really expensive. It takes a lot of, mental energy, but at the
Right.
end, we get really good, rigorous data. And
Yeah.
so that's what our conversation is based on. It's not our opinion.
And I know you had a good diverse background. You had all kinds of nationalities and
Yes,
income brackets, and you did your best to really spread that around, didn't you?
we did. We basically matched. We were doing the surveys in early 2021, and so the latest census data for the demographics of the United States was the 2018 survey. The 2020 survey wasn't available yet.
Yeah.
And so essentially we were trying to match the 2018 census across race, religion, age, geography, socioeconomic, gender, yeah.
Yeah.
They're all sorts of things.
Right. And I think the way you represented in the book, you did a really good job with that. And one of the questions that is on my mind is, how did you get people to answer honestly? Because I would think a lot of people might be hesitant to give you true, real, raw
Oh,
answers.
sure. Well, it's interesting. We have actually found over the years, one of the things that's been encouraging, because we've had that question from the very beginning. We're asking, for example, men how they really think about, some areas like their visual temptations.
Hmm.
And that can be a little,
You
you're
don't want to
asking
talk
some
about that.
pretty sensitive stuff. And
That's
so
right.
that's like from the very beginning, we've asked some of those types of questions. And one of the things that we have found is that when people know that they are completely anonymous, there is no way that I will ever know who they are, because these are all completely anonymous surveys. And all I know is that they're, person number 237 or whatever.
Yeah.
They give me I'm a man, I'm 44 years old. I've been married for 15 years. I live in California. Well, and I'm African American. Okay, well, there's lots of African American 44-year-olds
Right.
living in California. And so there's just no way that, out of the 50 million people living in California, that I would know who that one guy is.
Yeah.
And so there's a sense of safety. And so what ends up happening at the very beginning, we basically say, we are going to be talking about some inner things. Like, we really would love your candid input. You don't
Hmm.
have to take this survey, but if you want to, just be aware that this is for research. This is for a book. This is going to help people in such and such a way. And
Hmm.
a lot of people really want to help.
Yeah.
Like, and they get compensated. I mean, there's a little compensation that happens with, in order to get good data, you pay people for their time.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm guessing
and
though that the money that they got was really insignificant compared to the idea
oh,
of, well, I'm gonna be
sure,
part of something that's going to help other individuals.
sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure the different survey companies have different amounts, but you're taking a 15-minute survey and you're getting $5 or $10. I
Yeah, drop in
mean,
the bucket.
it's a drop in the bucket
Yeah,
for most people.
right.
But it's oh, wow, this is different. This isn't asking me about my favorite deodorant. This
Hmm.
is like,
Yeah,
this
it's
is
something
stuff
that really
that,
matters.
yeah.
Yeah. So I know you took a clinical as well as a biblical perspective with the
Yep.
research and the book. So just talk for a little bit about why that was important to you.
Well, so in this topic, like I said earlier, this topic of physical intimacy in marriage is so vulnerable and so sacred. And it is something that, a lot of people never talk about with even their closest friends,
Right.
right? And
Hmm.
maybe not even their spouse. And
Right.
so we wanted we wanted to be able to have an approach that honored both science and scripture.
Hmm.
We wanted to have an approach that was clinically excellent, well done, and trustworthy across the board. And so that's why we enlisted Dr. Seitzma, right? Because
Hmm.
we have known him for 20 years. He's been one of our advisors whenever we tackle this topic in other projects, which we've done. He's always helped us sort of think things through and, figure out the right way of, asking the questions or whatever. And so because he has been a sex therapist for he's probably, I think, 35 years of therapy experience and more than 35,000 hours of client time.
Hmm.
And he's got thousands of hours of supervision time. He knows all of the things to look for, all of the traps, all of here's things that in order to get accurate data, we're going to have to do it this way versus that way.
Yeah.
And so from a clinical perspective, It was so helpful because this really is such a specialized area.
Mhm.
There were plenty of times that I interpreted the data and I would, write something in a chapter or whatever. And he'd be like, actually, no, that's not what we're looking at. And he would show me and be like, oh, like stuff I never would have known because I'm not a specialist. So from the clinical perspective, that's the way we handled it. From a scriptural perspective, both of us, he's actually a pastor as
Mhm.
well. He's an
Yeah.
ordained pastor. And, for Jeff and I, as followers of Jesus, one of the things that's important to us is we really wanted to be able to bring the perspective of this isn't just honoring ourselves in our sex life or honoring our spouse. This is honoring God in this part of life that he designed for
Right.
our marriages. And what does that mean? Like, what does he say? And that's not a huge part of the actual content of the book. It's a
Yeah.
big part of the last chapter, kind of the conclusion.
Mhm.
But all the way through, we wanted to make sure that that we were bringing at least a biblical mindset
Right.
to secular research.
So
Yeah.
the biblical foundation for you as you were going through the research, what kind of kept you within the guardrails, so to speak? This
Yeah.
this is we're going to make sure everything lines up with what we understand, what the Bible teaches on this subject.
Well, and for example, both from a biblical perspective and a research perspective, a lot of things end up coming out in the same way, believe it or not, because research tends to prove what the Bible has said all along. And so, for
Say that again.
example, when you, for example, if you look at how married and unmarried people handle their physical relationship, there's some vast differences. And
Hmm.
so both from a biblical perspective and from a research perspective, we just focused on married couples.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
That's excellent. Really good. So I'm thinking that a lot of people listening right now, the question on their mind is frequency. So, so I know you
I'm
tackle this
quite sure
subject.
you're right,
You,
David.
you tackle this
Yeah.
subject in the book as you should have,
Yeah.
and it's not uncommon for couples to have a difference of opinion there about how often they should be coming together. So, in your book, you say if a spouse is unhappy about how often they have sex, they're 10 times more likely also be unhappy in their marriage. So, can you
Yes.
speak to that a little bit?
Yes. This issue of frequency is highly correlated to all sorts of other issues in marriage. And I need to say right up front for people who are research oriented and listening, we do not know causation yet, right? Like that's further research is needed, but there's strong correlation. And you can assume in whatever we're going to be just sort of describing here that in some ways, the causation, the arrow goes both ways. Something is happening because you're having a lot of frequency because you're happy in marriage,
Right.
for example,
Hmm.
as opposed to your frequency is making you happy in marriage. It's probably both,
Right.
right? It probably goes both ways. However, you cannot ignore some of these correlative factors. And this one that you mentioned about frequency is it just statistically was pretty eye opening. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the most common areas of heartache in people's physical life, in their intimate life, in their marriage, is the simple pain, but it's pain, is the simple pain of one person wanting more
Right.
than the other. And that is the case with 79% of couples, right? 21% of couples are happily on the same page about
1 in 5
about the
about that.
about the amount, but in 79%, so you have 8 out of 10 couples, they're not on the same page.
Hmm.
And sometimes they're actually not that far apart, but it still causes this immense, there's so much pain, and it's often because of the reason that you attribute to that. So you think, why doesn't my spouse find me desirable? Why would they rather, stay up late and watch Netflix then come to bed at the same time, and engage in that way. You attribute all these things to, it must be about me, I'm not desirable, or they're just frigid, or, why am I having to chase them around the bed? Isn't this something that is supposed to be a part of the joy of
Be
marriage?
natural. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that is so common. Like I said, 79%, right?
Yeah.
And so the first thing to tell people who are listening to this, just to actually say this out loud, is for you to realize, if that is your experience, you're obviously not alone.
Yeah.
That's actually one of the big myths that we found that needs to be debunked, is that we don't even talk about this topic with our closest friends. Like I said earlier, we have no grid for what's going on out there. This is the only topic in marriage that you never talk about.
Right.
Most people never talk about with somebody else. So you don't know, like, you think you're the only one who has this issue. Well, you're not, right? You're not alone. And so that's sort of the first thing to be aware of. But then the second thing to be aware of is that actually getting on the same page about frequency, it requires tearing down some other myths. And it requires actually recognizing what are the reasons for that, because they're not what people tend to think they are. For example, what we found is that most of the time when you're not on the same page and you're not maybe connecting as often as one person wants, that the person with maybe the higher desire, right, the person with the higher drive, they will often think that there's just one reason for that. And maybe both people think there's just one reason for that. They just attribute it to, well, it's the person with the lower desire, right? Like the one person just has a lower sex drive, and that's the reason. And if you think about it, that puts an immense amount of pressure on the person with the lower drive, because then it's their fault that we're not connecting, and all the arguments are all because of you. And somebody could think, what's wrong with me, right? And what we found that was so helpful to know is that it's actually, it's usually statistically not because somebody has a lower sex drive. They do maybe have a lower sex drive, but the reason you're not connecting is probably not just that. There's all these other factors. And so that's what we were trying to cover in the book, is what are all those other factors, right? Like that's some of the 8 findings, is what are the other things that get in the way. And so just as a starting point, that's the encouragement to everybody, is look underneath the surface, look at all the other things that could be going on, rather than just pointing the finger to yourself or to somebody else as the problem.
That's very good. So, I almost hesitate to ask this, but I'm trying to think of what someone might have on their mind, because I know there's a wide variety of answers here. But on average, and averages can be deceiving, but on average, what does the average couple have for frequency? How often are they having sex?
Okay, I can answer that question, but I have to say a caveat first.
Yes. Okay, go
ahead.
ahead.
Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
Right. So one of the most common questions that you get when you start studying this topic is, how often should we? Right? Like that's what a lot of people are actually asking when they're asking for the average. Is like, how often should we? And the reality is there is no how often should we answer. It is drastically different for different couples, different stages of life, different ages. Do you have medical issues? Does one of you travel a lot? Is it like, there's just so many different variables. So that I will tell you the average, but I do want everybody to know that is not what is necessarily right for you. There is a wide array. So that said, the average across everybody on this nationally representative survey was 1 1/3 times per week. And Jeff and I do a lot of marriage conferences, like at churches. We'll come in and talk about some of our research and encourage the marriages. And if we do talk about this topic at all in that process, and I share that number, people always come up to me afterwards and they're like, could you unpack that third for me? One and
What
a
does that
third
mean
times a week.
exactly?
What does that mean? Like, do you stop a third of the way through? Like, what is that? And no, it just means 4 times every 3 weeks
Yeah.
is the average.
Got you. But there's a wide range of what works for different couples, right?
Well, actually, interestingly, again, one of the things we show in the book, which, I encourage everybody to like look at the pages in the book rather than trying to just visualize this mentally. But if you picture a pie chart that shows the national distribution, one of the things that shocked me, didn't shock Dr. Seitzma because, nothing shocked him.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really surprised me is the vast array of distribution. It was basically almost, if you picture a pie chart, it was basically almost like a quarter, a quarter, a quarter, a quarter. Like there was no one main answer for how
Right.
often people were engaging. It was all over the map.
Mm-hmm.
And actually one of the things that was concerning was that one of those numbers, it was actually 23%, were in what the sex therapy community calls sexless marriages. So 23% of the population is having sex less than once a month or never. And so 9% of the population is never. 14% of the population is somewhere between never and less than once a month. So, a few times a year. And that is interesting because now that could be related to all sorts of different issues. Right. That, by the way, is also very related to age. That, as you can imagine, that tends to increase with age. But there's also a lot of other medical issues. There's also a correlation with sexual pain. A lot of women and even some men have sexual pain. And so there's all sorts of reasons for that sexless marriage number. But nevertheless, in the sexless marriages, it correlated with a lot of other marriage issues. Like there is something about our intimate relationship with our spouse that God has designed to be protective. There's something about it that God has designed to help kind of create more flow in all the other areas of our married life. And to make us softer with one another and to have literally it can be as simple as some of the chemicals that get stirred up in the body that make us more likely to have grace with our spouse. And that is it appears to be so important to a marriage that when it's not happening, it opens up the door for other difficulties that the couple would rather not have.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this quote that you had in the book, and you said, just as oil is a lubricant of an internal combustion engine, sexual relationship can be the lubricant in a marriage.
Yeah.
And I
promise I did not intend a double entendre.
Really?
It just works as an analogy.
Well, it does work. I'd like to add to that a little bit. When I was younger, I used to rebuild engines, worked on upward motors. And the oil is super important to the life of that engine. And if you have bad oil or no oil, it's going to add friction to the internal components of that engine. And they're going to wear out prematurely. There's going to be extra heat. There's going to be extra wear and tear on that engine, and it eventually will fail. So I think we have a lot of parallels between that and a marital relationship, that you're going to have unintended friction. If this is not resolved, if this isn't, if you can't have a meeting of the minds here on sexual frequency or in your sex life in general, it's going to create friction in your marriage, and it's going to put unnecessary stress and wear and tear on your relationship, and hopefully wouldn't cause failure. But there's a lot of parallels there. I think that's a very good metaphor.
Well, and the thing that was encouraging is that even amongst some of the sexless marriages, they had a great marriage, right? I can't remember the numbers were, but it was something like a third of the sexless marriages said that their marriage was spectacular. Both people agreed. We did this anonymous, it's called a matched pair survey, where we knew this husband number 135 is married to wife number 135. Like we could match their answers.
Okay.
And so we could tell, if both of them said, oh yeah, we have a really happy marriage, then okay. Right. Like we knew that. I think it's about a third of the sexless marriages still had a great, marriage, but it's very telling that I think it was 2/3 that didn't.
Yeah.
Right. Like that it was either kind of middle of the road or really actually kind of struggling. And again, the arrow goes both ways. If you're not having sex, maybe your marriage gets worse, but maybe your marriage is worse so you don't have sex, right? Like it could be either of those.
Right.
Probably
Which
both.
came first, chicken or the egg, right? We don't know.
Right. And it's probably both. But again, you can't ignore that we saw all of these issues in marriage start to arise if the couple wasn't making this a priority. Or if, for example, let's just say one member of the couple was really kind of resistant to physical intimacy. Maybe they had trauma in their past, or maybe the relationship needed to be worked on, whatever the issues were. If one person wasn't willing to work on it, and so they kind of devolved into, well, we just don't connect in that way. You're missing this lubrication that God has designed for the engine to run.
Right.
And so again, you can still have a good marriage. Like I said, I think it was a third. But it's something for everybody to take really seriously.
For sure. You have a lot of advice for couples on how they resolve differences. But one of the things I wanted to make sure we hit on was the different types of desire. And one of the things that you say in there is, in general, for men, desire leads to sex, while for women, sex leads to desire.
Yes.
So we're wired differently, right? And can you speak to that for a little bit?
Yeah, because I know everybody listening to you just went, what?
What did he just say? Yeah.
What did he just say? Yeah, so one of the things that was, to me, a pivotal finding that we have actually seen this alone has actually made a pretty substantial difference to many, many couples, is that most people don't realize there's different types of desire. So one of the myths, I said you said at the beginning, we kind of believe some myths that are getting in the way.
Right.
One of those that we haven't maybe even articulated to ourselves, but we see, like, for example, the way that the process of getting to a sexual encounter is portrayed in a movie, right? Like how does Hollywood portray that, or what you read in a book or whatever, or as like Jeff always points out, what you hear from 16-year-old boys in the locker room, which was, of course, 16-year-olds are the best experts on this topic.
Right.
But one of the things that we don't realize is in our minds, most of us have this idea that there's just one way that sex and desire works. And you feel desire, like you look at the way Hollywood portrays it, and the man and the woman look at each other and they both feel this hunger, right? Like there's this spark, there's this desire for sex. And so they do something about it. Pretty soon they're kissing and the clothes are off and they're in bed, right?
Right.
And it turns out that is a portrayal of one primary type of desire, which you could call initiating desire. But there's actually two primary types of desire. And the second one is called receptive desire. And the key is to recognize that less than half, by the way, of the population has initiating desire. 55% of the population has receptive desire. And receptive desire is just as legitimate. It's just you never see it portrayed in a movie or on television. And so you don't know it's a thing. Yeah. Like you have no idea it's a thing. Like you have no idea that it exists.
Right.
But so receptive desire, let me just, do you mind if I just explain what this is?
Absolutely.
Please briefly?
Do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the person with receptive desire, the physiology of that person's makeup actually kind of works in the reverse order. The desire process works in the reverse order. Instead of feeling desire and doing something about it, the person with receptive desire usually doesn't feel desire. Like they don't have that feeling of hunger. And instead they decide to get engaged with their spouse sexually. It's a decision that they're making, knowing that it'll be good for them eventually, right? Like, because they've done this many times and they know that that sense of desire will kick in. And so the person with receptive desire, they're making a decision, like an intellectual or out of love for their spouse or out of knowing it'll be good eventually, whatever. They're deciding to get engaged. And as their physiology starts getting stimulated, and assuming that they see that positively, right? Like, because, this is all assuming that we're talking about a generally healthy relationship. This is not abuse, but assuming that they see that positively, then their sense of desire may kick in. And that sense of desire is what their spouse felt 5 or 10 minutes ago. And so it is incredibly helpful for people to recognize, oh, wait, I'm not broken. Like what I see in Hollywood, I've felt broken, because that's not me. Right. And so that person who thinks that, it's like, oh, I'm not broken. This is my design. This is my physiology. And the key is for both people, if you have by far the biggest, the largest representation of couples was one person had initiating, one person had receptive. And it tends to be men and women in that order, but not always. Right. About a quarter of women have the initiating desire. About 16% of women, I believe, have initiating desire. But regardless, if in most marriages you have one that is initiating and one that is receptive, the key is you just have to work with each other's wiring. Yeah. Rather than wishing it was something different and then getting upset because it's never different, because it's not going to be. Right. You have to work with it. Absolutely. And, I think the real trouble might come in when you have both spouses are receptive desire. So that's going to be stand around and look at each other. If you don't understand it, you're going to say you'd be likely, as you just said, likely to conclude there's something wrong with us, right? Yeah, it doesn't interest us. It's just not. We're just weird. We're just strange. When the truth is, none of that is true. No, you just have receptive desire, right? So, and that's I believe that's either 24 or 25% of the population. Yeah, actually. Yeah. So again, not a tiny number, right? Yeah, absolutely. So, in your book for women only, you mentioned that 3 out of 4 women, 73%, said they would want to make love more frequently if their husband would maintain or increase his level of emotional attention. Yes. So that kind of applies. I know it's another book, but it does apply here. So, totally. So what can men do to do that? How can we more hit the bullseye for our wives? Because men do tend to have that initiating desire more often. Not all the time exclusively, but they do. So what can men do to reach their wives on an emotional level that would help stimulate some of that desire? Well, and the number, by the way, is 58%, 59%, something like that, of men have initiating. It's actually surprising that 35% have receptive desire, by the way. But that, again, tends to happen as a couple gets older, as well as the man gets older. That receptive desire tends to come in. So I just want to encourage men, if you're not in that initiating bucket, you're not weird, right? Like a lot of men aren't. But what can you do if you are, right? If you're the initiating spouse and your wife is the receptive spouse, what do you do? You see that survey question about, increase your emotional attention. And you think, I don't know what that means, right? So let me just give the husbands out there a little bit of a perspective. What will help is if you tell yourself, if your spouse has receptive desire, okay, then she is making a decision to get engaged with you sexually. What is that decision going to be based on? If you think about it, that decision is going to be based on how she feels about you in the relationship the rest of the day. Right. Right? Because she's making a decision. It's not like there's this sexual desire that just like overcomes her and she can't stop herself. I know that that's what every husband wants, but that is not, unfortunately, the physiological reality for most women.
Yeah.
And so she is making a decision. So you have to kind of go, okay, so if she's making a decision based on how she feels about me, based on how she feels about the relationship, the question is, am I making her feel cared for every day? Am I making her feel loved every day? Doing what I can do. Because, there's some things you can't do. It's that, she has to decide to receive that love, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And recognize that actually what you think will make her feel loved is not necessarily what actually works for her, which is why, again, our research for women only and for men only, which is the book for men about their wives,
Mm-hmm.
is so helpful, because it's like statistically, these are the things that tend to make a woman feel loved. And giving you a couple of examples of that, believe it or not, one of the things that is huge is the feeling that you're pursuing her still, even though you caught her, right? Like, even though that you've been married for 28 years or whatever. And if you think about pursuit and that sort of sense of pursuing her, think about it like, okay, what did you do when you were dating? And not, by the way, many men are like, like that was exhausting. No, not like, not like the candlelight dinners you arranged, although, that's fine. That's great. But that's not what we're talking about. When you were dating, you were sending her a message saying, I love you today.
Yep.
I want you today. I'm pursuing you today. And the reason that's important, and this is one of the things that we cover, is that for most women, even after they get married, they still have a question in their hearts of, am I lovable? Like, does he really love me?
Yeah.
Like, is he glad he married me? And so you can tell her, I'm glad I married you, just by reaching across and taking her hand when you're walking across a parking lot.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's super
like
useful.
that is pursuit.
Right.
Or you're sitting at church and you put your arm around her at church. That says, I'm so glad I married you. I would choose you all over again. You're mine, right?
Yeah.
Like, these little messages, texting her in the middle of the day saying, oh, this has been such a tough day. My boss has been all over me. I can't wait to see you later. I love you so much. I'm so glad you married me. And then sending that text message, like, she'll screenshot that text message and keep it.
Save it.
Yeah, because that is what sends that pursuit message.
What you're saying is super true. And I got to share a quick story. Michelle and I have been married for 24 years, and I'm a very goal-oriented guy. I was then, I still am today, and I like to set goals and go after them. And one of my good friends at our wedding reception, Michelle and I were sitting down with our meal, and we had a glass of champagne in front of us. My friend comes over to us and says, "Oh, Dave, congratulations! Oh, thanks a lot." He says, "So now that you got the wife, what's your next goal?" And that was like a dagger to the heart of my new bride. And that was hurtful. And there was some truth to it. That's what made it even more hurtful. And to this day, Michelle will share that story from time to time on how much that was, she was in a state of shock to hear that from a good friend, someone who'd known me most of my life.
Yeah.
And that's not what a woman needs to hear.
Well, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense from a guy's perspective, because when a guy gets married, and this is crucial, not just for your intimate life, for the rest of your marriage. So guys, if you're listening, this is crucial, is when a guy gets married, he does not, what we found is that men and women tend to have two different like primary insecurities running under the surface, where women's is, am I lovable? Like, that is the one for women. Men's is more likely to be, am I able? Right?
Yes.
And so when a guy gets married, he just stops questioning, does my wife love me? Like, that's been settled. I mean, maybe if things go really bad, sure. But I mean, in general, like, it just doesn't come up. Does she love me? Well, like, of course, like, we're married. Like, of course she loves me. And he doesn't realize that's because you don't have that insecurity running under the surface. Your insecurity is more, am I any good at being a great dad? Am I any good at what I do at work? Am I, it's about what I do.
Yeah.
And so you don't realize as a husband there is no switch in a woman's brain that gets flipped to the, oh, now I feel permanently loved position. And she has that question every day.
Every day.
So
Yeah.
she's looking to you for the answer to that question every day, which is why the Bible talks about husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. It's a command because God knows that men will just otherwise assume that, oh, she knows I love her. No, that's why that command is there, because she doesn't necessarily. She doubts that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And so the command is, no. Like, find ways to love your wife every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So, Shaunti, we're running out of time here, but man, this has been so great. So, if you could, in way of wrap up, just share the most important thing you want people to take with them from this conversation, what would it be?
So the most important thing for me that was so encouraging about this project is that it is a truism that we don't realize is true, that even when we are not on the same page about our intimate life, and even when there's heartache, that it turns out, much closer than we think we are. Like, when you actually look at the statistics, the husband, for example, might say, I want sex 2 to 3 times a week. The wife might say, I want it 1 to 2 times a week. Okay. As our co-author said, there's not much difference between 2 and 2. And so what is getting in the way when you actually both are relatively close, it turns out, is all these relatively little things that you just didn't know mattered. And that you have myths that are kind of getting in the way. And once you debunk those myths, and once you get a little new knowledge, it's like, oh my goodness, like, it is so much simpler for most couples, it is so much simpler than you realized. Now, there are going to be some couples that have a more significant road ahead, because they are going to be having to solve, trauma from childhood, or sexual pain, or somebody has an addiction, or whatever.
Yeah.
But the good news is even those can all be addressed. And so that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, is that we wanted to help people get that hope.
Yeah. So again, the book is called Secrets of Sex and Marriage, 8 Surprises That Make All the Difference. Shaunti, if someone wants to get a hold of you or get a copy of the book, where should they go?
Well, the easiest thing, and there's a lot of resources for you if you're interested, is at secretsofsexandmarriage.com. is a website that we created with Dr. Michael Seitzma, with a bunch of other resources. So including referral resources, like the person who says, actually, we do have somebody with an addiction. Like, what do we do? Okay, there's referral resources there.
Mm-hmm.
That can help you get help, more specialized help. And there's some really good articles, links to different courses that might help. So I'm hoping that people will be encouraged once they actually look at this. They'll be encouraged to see that it is simpler than they thought.
Yeah, well, I believe they will be. I sure was by reading the book.
Oh,
Shaunti, thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely, David. Thanks for having me on.
For more, go to the show notes page at davidsandstrom.com/127. There you can find links to all the resources that we mentioned, as well as an audio and a video version of the podcast and more. If you're getting value out of this podcast, I sure would appreciate you letting a friend know about it. Holistic health from a biblical perspective is relatively hard to come by, and I believe that your friend will appreciate you sharing the show with them. That's it for now. Thank you for listening. I'll talk with you next time. Be blessed.